is a French seam, and it's an enclosed seam that's often used on delicate fabrics where you don't want to see overlocking or any other kind of finish on the inside. As you can see on the inside here, it's a completely bound edge. Well, but it's self-bound, so the raw edges are caught up in that seam allowance there. It's an easy enough one to do, although there are a couple more steps to it than the average plain seam. So I'm popping these together with the raw edges aligned here. I've got wrong sides facing each other here, right sides facing out, and I'm going to stitch this with a 3mm seam allowance. So I'm moving my needle there. You might have something else you can line up on your presser foot at 3mm, or that's 1/8 of an inch if you speak that language. And I'm going to stitch it down the edge here. Alternatively, if you can't get 3mm, you would set your seam allowance width so that you had an extra few millimeters on there, and stitch it with a 6mm seam allowance, which you could then trim back to 3. So a 1/4 inch foot or an industrial sewing machine both have a 6mm gap there that you would run the edge along here. This one's 3 or 4. 3, 4, it doesn't really matter. We're not being too precise. So, and there. Okay, so there's our little seam allowance there. I'd give that a press here with an iron, not hands. I'm just using hands for expedience sake on the machine. I would then turn it. Now this is the wrong side of fabric, but we want to make sure that none of this fabric's going to be caught into a little lip shape here. We want that to be as flat as we can make it. And then what I do is turn it to this is the right side of fabric, and I press this seam allowance open, which allows you to get the fabric as flat as possible so that we'll be able to turn it back on itself and get a really clean finish. But before we turn it back, we're just going to double check to make sure in doing that we haven't messed up a whole lot of little threads like that. So because this is going to be on the right side of fabric, we don't want these little edges hanging out beyond the seam. So I'm going to trim those off and just make sure you get that all out of the way. This is the point where if you've sewn it at 6mm, you can just trim it back to 3 or 4. So that's if you've sewn it at 1/4 inch and you're trimming it back to 3 or 4mm. You can do it right now. Okay, so it's all pressed, it's all trimmed. I'm going to fold it back and keep that seam exactly on the edge there. And again, this would be done on the ironing board, not at the sewing machine. And pressed again in this direction. So now I'm going to stitch this seam with a 6mm or 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I've moved my needle. Again, that's where if you've got a presser foot that has that exact width, you can use that. And I'm going to stitch it all along the edge here. And I'm using black thread just so that you can see it, but it's best to use fabric and thread of the same colour. It's not going to be seen. This is just so you can see it from this distance. There's our 6mm seam allowance there, and hopefully on the right side of fabric, ta-da, you don't see any of those raw edges. It's just a plain, clean line. So that's your French seam. Give it a press and be very proud of it.